Okay, I'm a recovering engineer. I moved to the dark side of sales and marketing back in 1979 when I launched Atari's home computer back in Silicon Valley. And I was with a number of young companies out there, including Corva Systems, where I launched OmniNet, the first local area network for personal computers. I was with a underfunded startup, which everybody should do once in their life. My wife has said I've done it too often. And then I did my first turnaround when I was on the West Coast. And moved back here. I'm originally from New York, so is my wife. She never really liked it in California. And we agreed on Massachusetts and moved back here in 1989. Originally, I was talking with Ken Olson to run the PC division at DEC, but it became obvious I was going to get all of the responsibility and none of the authority, so I said no. And I immediately got into consulting. And it's something I always wanted to try. And originally it was under my own name. And then back in '99 I formed the CXO advisory group with a number of individuals where we go in as a part-time COO, Chief Marketing, Chief Sales, Chief Revenue Officer. Our clients range in size from startup to about 40 million. Because of my background, mostly tech. Though I've had some in food and beverage, some in nutraceutical, a couple in the fashion industry. And about 20% of my business has been working with international firms and setting up U.S. operations. Okay. Well, the first thing they have to do is really identify their target market, right? Who they're going to be addressing. And one problem that startups have is they typically look at a huge market and they try to shotgun approach and basically go after the whole market. The problem is with limited resources, limited dollars, limited personnel, they just can't have much of a bandwidth. Any market that you identify an opportunity in, I guarantee you there are probably 1,000 different ways to segment that market. And then what you have to do is evaluate each of the segments. And what you want to do is pick the low-hanging fruit, the segments that are going to give you your best chance of success. They'll be your beachhead markets, right? Using the military term, where you storm the beach, you consolidate it, you get a cash flow going, you get your operations going before you really scale it to other industries. And then, after you've got that going and running well, then you move to the next market segment adjacent to where you are. One problem that startups have when they do segment the markets, many times they'll identify a beachhead market, do fairly well in it, but then the next market they pick is way off in left field, which cannot build on any of the infrastructure that they've put in place. So once you identify the target market, some of the things that you need to figure out is two things. Who is the customer? You need to build the profile of who your customer is. You want to know things, the demographics. You want to know their age, their income level if you're dealing on the consumer end. Who makes the purchase decisions? If you're B2B or B2C, that's different, right? If you're dealing in the corporate marketplace, typically the end user is not going to be the person that actually has the purchasing authority, right? And you need to understand that, and you need to develop then a persona, not just for the user, but for the buyer as well. Right? So you want to know everything about the buyer. Now, the thing is, before you can figure out anything you're going to be doing from a product standpoint, market standpoint, or whatever, is what's going to motivate that buyer or that end user. Right? And people buy on emotion, but they justify with statistics and logic. I learned that the first time when I was at Atari. When we were selling into the home market, we were the first to do that with a PC. Well, actually, this was before there was an IBM PC. And consumers were buying it basically as a high-end video game system, but they were justifying it on an educational level to teach their kids how to use computers. Right? So that's when I learned there's a disconnect between what people actually buy it for and how they justify it. Right? And you need to understand what those motivators are. And people buy for three basic emotional reasons. The number one emotion is pain. Right? If they have a pain, they'll do whatever they have to, pay whatever they have to get rid of that pain. But the key is the person they want, or the company that they want to solve that pain, has to be an expert, because they don't want a plumber taking out their appendix. The second basic emotion is fear of pain. So if you think about it, whole industries are set up because of fear. The insurance industry, the antivirus, anti-malware industry, the military-industrial complex. It's all set up for fear, right? That's why they exist. So never underestimate the fear of pain. And then the third is, what can they gain? Money, sex, love, power, right? Will depend very much on who you're dealing with. In many cases, you're going to have to deal with all three of those. But if there's definitely a pain point, that'll be the main motivator, whether it's a consumer or a B2B marketplace. You can basically take those three emotions and align them with that. Other things that you want to do, once you've identified those things, is you want to identify how the buyer and how the user wants to be engaged and how they want to buy, right? If you were dealing with my father and trying to sell a product or service to him, you basically had to have an ad on TV, or an ad in a newspaper, or an ad in a magazine. For me, when I first got into business, I read 3 newspapers, including the Wall Street Journal Daily. I read at least a dozen or more monthly publications in technology and business, etc. And so it was very common. But nowadays, I'm hardly ever reading. Right? Everything I get is online. So that's the way to get to me, either online or through my network of contacts. If you want to get to my youngest daughter, who's a millennial, right? It's got to be on her phone. That's where she gets the bulk of her information, right? Plus online. But it has to be mobile for her. She does everything on her phone. Most millennials do. So you have to understand how they want to be engaged. And also, how do they want to buy, right? Different market segments have different buying patterns, and you have to understand that. So for instance, if you're selling a high-end consumer product that you really want to sell to high net worth individuals, and you want to go to retail, you want to be in Nordstrom's, you want to be in Lord & Taylor, you want to be in Macy's maybe. You don't want to be in Walmart, because if you happen to be in Walmart, your high net worth individuals are never going to see you. And the profile of their typical customers will never buy your product. So you want to make sure that if you're not on the shelf where they expect you to be, they're never going to see you to purchase you. When you're talking about the value proposition of firms, most of them get it wrong, especially technologists. And I was an engineer, so I used to talk in bits and bytes and expected everybody to talk in bits and bytes. But that's not what they motivate. Remember, we talked about the 3 basic emotional reasons why people buy. So when you think about your elevator pitch, and most business schools get the elevator pitch wrong. They tell you have 1 to 2 minutes for an elevator pitch. A perfect elevator pitch really should be 30 seconds, 60 seconds max. And I'm from New York, so you only have 8 seconds to grab my attention. If you don't grab my attention in the first 8 seconds, I basically glaze over, and it's hard to get me engaged after that. What you want to do is have some sort of hook to that audience. You've got to look at, where they teach you on your elevator pitch is that your elevator pitch is your elevator pitch is your elevator pitch. It's the same all over. Nothing could be more from the truth. Really, what you need, look at it, you have to develop your core message. And look at the core message as a plain cupcake. And my wife says the purpose of a cupcake is nothing more than to be a delivery vehicle for the icing. And she likes chocolate. I like vanilla. A buyer might like strawberry, right? A corporate client may like Tutti Frutti. A venture capitalist likes something else. So you need to take that core message and add the icing or the hook that's going to interest them to pay attention to you. That's the same thing from a marketing standpoint, the same thing from a pitch standpoint. I'll give you a case in point. Back at Qualogy, we came out with the first ruggedized personal computers. This is back in circa 1984. 84 or 85, I can't remember, too far back. My manufacturing cost was about 3 times that of a standard PC. But I was able, instead of selling it for $15,000, I was able to sell it for $120,000 because of the value of the unit. Because, for instance, GM was trying to put in easier to use front ends on their manufacturing line. So they were taking desktop PCs, putting it on the manufacturing line, connected to process controllers. The thing is, they typically had a shelf life, a survivability rate of no more than a week. And every time they had to replace a unit, their manufacturing line was down for about 6 minutes. And that would cost them $10,000 a minute. And we designed this as a ruggedized system, and their calculations showed that the mean time between failure should be about 1.5 years. So at $120,000, it paid for itself in a few months. Most companies have, especially if they deal in the B2B marketplace, if you ask them, they have a sales cycle, a defined sales cycle. The thing is, studies have shown that 80 or 85% of all sales cycles are wrong. The reason being is most sales cycles are generated from the company looking outward, okay, based on what they think they need to do. What they really should be doing is identifying the process the buyer is going to go through. What are the decision gates that the buyer is going to go through? And then this way they can develop a sales cycle that basically meets the needs or overlays onto that buyer's process. And that's much more efficient because now you can develop marketing materials, sales materials, etc. to help that buyer go from decision gate to decision gate to decision gate, as opposed to generating materials. For instance, most salespeople spend 40 to 60 hours a month doing their own sales material, and 85% of all marketing materials go unused by sales because they consider them worthless and not usable. Well, again, it all starts with identifying who the customer and the buyer are, right? You have to understand that, and you have to understand their motivators, because you have to, because of that, you have to understand how they're going to buy to get your distribution channels in place. Now, once you've got all that done, you've got to figure out the pricing. Right? That's usually where startups have problems. A lot of times, they'll price their product figuring they're going to start off selling direct online. And let's take an example that their cost of goods is 23%. Their SG&A is 15%, which is the average for the Fortune 500. If you're dealing with Fortune 500 consumer companies, it's 18%. But the thing is, for a startup, your SG&A costs are actually going to be higher than that. So if they're selling a product for $100, that means they're making a 62% gross margin selling direct. Now, that's fine as long as you're selling direct. Now, unless they figure out that they're going to be selling through a distribution channel early on, they need to add what the distribution channel is going to be expected to be earning into their pricing structure. So for instance, if you're dealing in retail, typical retailer wants to see a 50% gross margin. Right? They're going to give a lot of that away, but that's what they want to see up front. So if you look at that, that'll only leave you with about 12% based on what I just talked about. But it gets worse than that. Because you're a small company, many of the retailers aren't going to want to deal with you directly. They're going to want to deal with you through a distributor. And the distributor's also going to want their cut of 10 or 15%. So you could be left with 2% or negative numbers, right, if you price it just based on your selling online. So you need to know that, how you're going to sell up front and make sure you get that in there. The other is you've got to understand how they're doing business today, how they're getting that done. Most companies, when I ask them, who's your main competitor, I always get fill in the blank company. Apple, Google, Amazon, fill in the blank. The thing is, your biggest competitor is business as usual. The way they're getting it solved today, what they're using today to get people to change is very tough. You know, we have this grand idea about the human race. By US terms, the pioneer spirit conquering the West. By Star Trek terms, going where no one has gone before. The thing is, most people are fat, dumb, and happy and don't like change. They protect the status quo. Why? They may have something over here on the side that they've been using that basically, you know, kind of does what you're trying to do. It's not elegant, takes too much time, it costs too much, but they've used it forever, it works, and life is throwing them so much crap on a daily basis, both professionally and personally, that they're putting out fires. So to have this thing over here that's not elegant or costing too much, that's working, that's good enough, because they're putting out fires. So they protect the status quo. Take a look at Kodak. Kodak had all the initial patents for digital photography and digital photo printing. But they were too concerned with protecting their existing sales, right? The status quo. They were interested in protecting their paper sales, their film sales, their chemical sales. And what they didn't realize is if you're not willing to cannibalize your own products, somebody's going to do it to you. So to get somebody to change what they're doing is very, very difficult. And you have to have a compelling value proposition in many cases to get them to do that. Well, what you need to do is actually need to get out of the office and start talking to customers. You can't talk to customers too early. Right? Reid Hoffman has a great quote that I always use. He's the CEO of LinkedIn, which basically is, if you're not embarrassed by your first product, you've waited too long. Right? And so if you know who the buyers are going to be or the consumers are going to be, start talking with them, telling them what you're going to do, just getting feedback on what they think a minimal viable product is going to be. What would I need to have at a minimum to get you interested in trying this out? And even though you may have, and by talking with them, you'll wind up getting a whole list of features that you probably didn't even think about. And then you have to figure out how you're going to move them along. Now, it's going to be very different on the type of product you're dealing with, whether you're dealing with a consumable product or a software product, which doesn't cost all that much, it's really development, or a hardware product. Hardware product's going to take longer, it's going to require more money, right? And so you've got to figure out a way to bootstrap that initial product. It's easier to bootstrap with a software product than it is with hardware, right? So you have to figure that out. And so it's very critical, especially with a hardware product, is you want to get to market as fast as possible to start getting some feedback. Because anything, I guarantee you, Steve Blank has a great quote. I know I'm paraphrasing. Your business plan is absolutely perfect till the first time you talk to a customer. The customers that actually, companies that actually survive aren't the ones that strictly adhere to a business plan. They're the ones that are going to move and adapt, because it's not going to be a straight line. You're going to wind up pivoting many different times. And so you've got to have that customer feedback going on. One problem that startups have is they scale too fast. Right? The nice thing about the internet is you can test. You can do A/B testing. I'm a big believer in testing. Test before you scale. And also, you don't want to scale unless you can actually deliver. So if you're spending too much money to generate leads and you can't follow up on those leads, you're wasting money. Right? You're wasting money, time, and effort.